Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of the Cognition podcast. As always, I'm one of your co-hosts, Hutch. I'm an innovation principal at Trace3, the creator of the Sociosploit blog and the author of The Language of Deception, Weaponizing Next Generation AI.
And I am Len Noe, technical evangelist, Whitehat, and transhuman with CyberArk software, and the author of the upcoming book, Human Hacked: My Life and Lessons as the World's First Augmented Ethical Hacker.
And as always, we are going to start off the episode talking about a few interesting news articles that we saw since the last episode that caught our attention. The first one was a pretty fascinating $25 million heist on the Ethereum blockchain. Another was some of the recent problems that have come out of the first human trial in Neuralink. And then, of course, OpenAI has released their GPT-4o, which we absolutely must discuss. And then we're going to jump into the main segment where we are going to talk about the idea of the uncanny valley and how that relates to the progression of artificial intelligence and robotics today. So with that, we are going to go ahead and jump into the news. And Len, I'm going to let you take this first one about the Ethereum heist.
So, two brothers were actually able to find a vulnerability in the validation portion of the Ethereum blockchain. And we're actually, I was talking to Hutch before we got started. This was, from an attack perspective, this was so beautiful. I mean, they essentially snuck in right before the validation, and they were able to steal money right out of the blockchain in front of everybody. It just disappeared. Everything looked like it had went the correct way. There was your source address, your destination address, but when they looked, it just wasn't there. They were able to sneak in that split second right before the transaction was completed, almost SolarWinds kind of, supply chain style attack. We have never seen this before. And the funny thing is immediately we saw skeptics just jumping off of the walls going, this blockchain is now, it's been broken. It's no good anymore, and the truth is the blockchain was fine.
Yep. It was the validation protocol. So implementation flaw. Yeah, I agree. There was definitely some discussion that was overhyped in terms of the impact that this has on the usefulness and integrity of cryptocurrency. A couple of things that stood out to me in this article was one of the things that it mentioned was that, and I think even the title of the article was that two brothers were charged with a crime that previously did not exist. And I'm paraphrasing there, but they essentially had to charge these guys with wire fraud, which probably wasn't a one-for-one exact fit, but I think the closest thing that they could charge, and obviously you're not just going to get away with a $25 million heist without them charging you with something. So I think that was the closest thing they could find that would stick. But it is fascinating seeing as we move into a new era of digital currency that some of those very simple implementation flaws that we've seen in traditional technology implementations are now affecting financial transactions this way. So I think it was interesting to see that. It was also interesting, kind of what you alluded at, that somebody was talking about how this destroys the integrity of the blockchain, which I don't think it does. I think it just harkens back to the need to do thorough testing and threat modeling whenever you're building out implementations, especially for something that is this sensitive, because obviously anybody is, this is a prime target for cyber attacks. If you can manipulate a protocol and change the routing of financial transactions, this is exactly what any hacker wants to get their hands on.
Yeah, I found it kind of ironic. It was almost, in my opinion, kind of like the Al Capone, methodology of prosecution, to your point around the wire fraud. We can't get them for anything else. And obviously we can't go after tax evasion, but come on, being honest, these guys, they're going to wind up, if they're smart, they're going to do their time, and they're going to wind up becoming blockchain engineers when they get out of prison.
Yep, they'll be the next Kevin Mitnick of the cryptocurrency era. Yeah, you're probably exactly
Absolutely.
right. And yeah, they also mentioned that this was a 12-second attack, which obviously they also mentioned that 2 years of prep went into this. And you don't execute a 12-second attack without a lot of pre-programmed routines and essentially automation around how this attack took place. I'm sure they did a lot of testing offline with smaller transactions to figure out exactly how this would work. And then when the time came, I don't know if maybe sort by largest transaction and execute. I didn't get a sense from the article if it was a single transaction or just a bulk
Yeah,
sum
I
of
didn't
25
either.
million, though.
But for the record, could you imagine how long that 12 seconds probably felt for those two?
Yeah, for sure. Can you imagine how long the minutes following whenever the person realized that they lost $25 million felt?
Oh, I'm sure those were much longer. But
Yep.
from an attacker's perspective, respect for the tools and let this serve as a wake-up call to all of the blockchain engineers when it comes to your validation. And this is just one case. I've said it a million times. If I've said it once, attackers are nothing if not opportunistic. So, like you said, this is a great wake-up call. you know, get on that and realize that, everybody's vulnerable.
Yep. Hackers will find a way.
Hacker's going to hack.
All right. So our next article was, as we've discussed a couple times in recent episodes, Neuralink has moved forward with their first human trials for a brain-computer interface. And now there has been issues where that first human trial has seen essentially the way I understood it was that some of the technical connections to the brain tissue were withdrawing, that were becoming, I guess, less interconnected to that brain tissue.
Well,
Len, what are your thoughts on this?
honestly, it's not necessarily interconnected. It could be scar tissue. Basically, at some point, the ability to get clear signal transmission from the electrodes and the electrical signals from the brain across the wire has become degraded. We've talked in past episodes where, Neuralink is not the very first brain computer device that's ever been. And, they've been around for over decades, but the one thing that, I keep coming back to when it comes to these is we need to stop looking at this technology as basically a universally acceptable solution to the body. The ability for the human body to accept or reject third party, we'll call them add-ons, is not something that we're not familiar with. I mean, how many times have you ever heard of somebody getting like a liver transplant or a kidney transplant or something, and the body rejects the organ? The brain also has the ability to reject the implant. And this is actually something that we don't really hear a lot about, but there's countless case studies where there's been issues where, especially in the older BlackRock or BrainGate type brain computer machines, they had to be removed for the safety of the patient.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned scar tissue because I really hadn't considered that. I kind of immediately went to an immune response, but I guess scar tissue could just as easily degrade the electrical signals coming out of that portion of the brain as well.
Absolutely. And to swing this back around to you, Hutch, if you read the articles that are coming out, Neuralink really hasn't gotten into a lot of details in terms of what they've done to try and address this issue. But what they have released is that they've done numerous software updates to the implant. And to me, that means that they've got to be using some type of AI or some type of advanced, computing to try and
Well,
improve the
so just to
quality of those
clarify,
signals.
on that, they did say that it was software updates that actually enhanced the bits per second even greater than the initial. So to your point, you were saying possibly kind of plugging in the holes with something similar to generative AI.
I really think that what's might be done, because when we look at this, in terms of everything that I've ever researched, the doctors and the other people, people that I've interfaced with, once those electrodes, and these are as fine as like a hair, once those no longer are providing a very solid signal, the only way to correct that would be with in terms of actually getting better signal from the brain, would to be go back into the brain again and either correct what's going on with scar tissue placement. But it's not like you're going to just, it's not like a radio dish where you're going to be turning up the reception. You're only going to get what you're going to get. So for them to actually get a better throughput, that means they've got to be doing something at a software level, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think this is an interesting possibility of they've got a certain level of signal, and similar to what we talked about kind of when you take a low resolution image and you use software in order to bring it to a higher resolution, well, you're not actually getting a higher resolution of the original version of that image. You're essentially doing probabilistic analysis of what is most likely going to be the case for filling in those holes, filling in that empty amount of data based on the context that you do have. And so if they are doing that, I have to wonder to what extent we are losing precision in somebody being able to actually operate this mentally if we're making inferences about what those
well
that
I
data
can see
looks
where,
like.
to your point, I can see where that might be become an issue in time. But as we've discussed in the past, I mean, we're dealing with very, very basic functionality right now: up, down, left, right, select.
Right.
So maybe when we get to the point where the BCIs can take thought process and put that into paragraphs and sentences. But for right now, with 5 basic commands, I think you can get away with
Making
relative.
some inferences, making
You might
some.
be able to get away with some inferences with the limited command sets available, but this is not going to work long term.
I think one other thing that I mentioned when we were talking about this prior to jumping into this episode that was fascinating to me is the fact that we can already evaluate the data transmissions from the brain to that interface as bits per second. So essentially in the same type of digital signals and measurement of quantity of data that we use for traditional computing.
Well, I looked it up once before. Give me a second here. Keep talking, because there's one statistic. Since you brought it up, I want to go look this up right quick.
Well, yeah,
Because when
and
we're
I guess for
discussing
me,
the
what
brain,
it probably shouldn't be too surprising. I think it does draw into questions of kind of metaphysics. We have all of these discussions of, is the mind or is consciousness something completely different from the physical world? But then there's a lot of people that have this materialist perspective that consciousness and mental states are really just the physical manifestation of electrical signals. And to the extent that that's true, I think it's not surprising that we can translate these thought processes to bits of data.
in standardized terms. And according to the Scientific Americana, they've actually estimated that the human brain has a storage capacity of 2.5 petabytes. So we can even actually put a storage capacity on our brain now. So everything in terms of the brain is being referred to in the same context as we would for any type of computer network.
And I do wonder to what extent that does inform us of something maybe about metaphysics, like maybe that it does confirm that metaphysical assumption that the world and everything about consciousness and the subjective mental states that we have is really nothing more than bits and bytes, that it's data just like everything else.
And to end this concept, or this chain of thought, this is the one that's really going to tweak you out. So we told you the total storage capacity of the brain, but when we come down to the storage capacity of DNA, it is actually at 1 gram can store 215 petabytes of data within 1 gram of DNA.
That's crazy to think about. Yeah, I do know that there's been some interesting research about actually moving data via DNA and doing kind of data
Actually, it's
encoding
been done,
into the DNA
and I've
structure.
got the research on it. You can actually put an entire data center in less than 1 8-ounce glass worth of DNA.
And I think that also does speak to the efficiency of biology, even if it is a purely physical phenomenon. It does say kind of maybe how far we actually are from achieving. Because I mean, right now we've got something that still is not quite to human level intelligence and is taking up these entire massive data centers. And to think that we can have that much storage, that much compute within, I mean, like you said, a gram of DNA is
Deoxyribonucleic acid.
hard to fathom.
You know, but that last point, we are continuously seeing the human animal being more and more referred to in computerized technical terms.
Yeah, for sure. And just kind of understanding the mechanical nature of the way that we operate.
It's crazy. So now our next news option, this one, I'm going to throw this right back over to our resident AI lord. So let's talk about Chat Creepy T4.
Yep. So OpenAI just released their new GPT 4.0, which is GPT 4 Omni. And apparently there are some moderate increases in terms of intelligence benchmarks and in terms of its ability to interact with other modalities like vision and files. Uh, but what was really fascinating about this new model is the fact that it uses an end-to-end neural network that accepts as input natively audio and video and outputs natively audio. So in the past, if you interacted with the voice function of GPT-4, it was multiple different models that were pulled together. You would speak to it and it would use a voice to text model in order to convert the things that you said into text. It would then pass that text through the large language model through GPT-4. GPT-4 would then process that input text, output its text. Then it would use another model to convert its output text to voice in order to communicate back to you. And with GPT 4.0, it is natively accepting as input audio. When you talk to it, it is receiving it as audio instead of trying to translate it into text. It is also outputting as audio. So it is really truly that multimodal model that is operating in all kinds of different modalities. And not only does this result in a reduction of latency, but even more fascinating is that with all of the conversational audio data that this system was trained on, it now as almost an emergent property, because it has this sense of emotional intelligence and social intelligence, unlike anything that we've seen before. And none of that is explicitly programmed into it. Instead, all of that is an emergent property from the conversational data that it was trained on and the fact that it is operating natively on an end-to-end system that is using input audio, output audio. It also can take input video currently, where you can in real time show it things with your phone and it can react to that video. And so while the intelligence benchmarks have not increased substantially from 4 to 4.0, this still is an unbelievably huge step forward in terms of getting closer and closer to that artificial general intelligence, to something that operates closer to a way that we as humans operate. And I mean, honestly, it's kind of creepy. I think it's definitely worth watching the videos for anybody that hasn't seen the demos yet, because I think it will blow you away in terms of what this is capable of. And one of the other things that we talked about is just how similar this is to the movie Her, which was a movie from over a decade ago with Joaquin Phoenix and Scarlett Johansson, and they essentially create this disembodied AI voice. And what was fascinating was the voice that is used by GPT 4.0 sounds so similar to Scarlett Johansson in the way that she sounded in Her. And not just the voice, but the level of that social intelligence and emotional intelligence. So it's fascinating. It's also a little bit creepy.
I think we just need to rename it to Creepy T. That's just me.
Creepy. I like it.
But, the thing that it's the way that it imitates standard speech. And I'm not going to say that it's talking because it's an imitation. The machine doesn't have, the real emotion. And to your point about the videos, the thing that really hit me, and for anybody that hasn't seen the videos, there's one example that I just looked at and went, oh my God. You have a father and his son sitting there. There appears to be some type of trigonometry mathematic problem. And this is on a tablet, the GPT app. You give it permission to the screen. The father tells the technology, I want you to tutor him on this. I do not want you to give him the answer. Teach him. And I watched what I would perceive as the end of quite a few careers in the educational process, tutors. But then from that simple thing, it keeps spinning me back to the idea of we are putting so much faith behind these data models, but where is the transparency in terms of the model itself? To your point, one of the other videos shows the fact that you can do on the fly real-time translations between languages. This is a great feature. But once again, we're back down to who is watching the Watchmen. And this is one of the big problems I'm having, because there's so many things in the media right now in terms of the fear of losing jobs to artificial intelligence. And with good reason, if you ask me. But let's take the education for just a second, and at the risk of wading into a potentially dangerous zone, I'm going to choose my words very carefully. Education is not the same education that I received 40 years ago. So if we're going to start utilizing these types of tools for educating our youth or trying to teach them history, whose history are we teaching? How do we get to something that is universally acceptable, but also allows for transparency, especially if we're going to start using this to educate the next generations?
Yeah. And I think we are seeing this interesting inverse relationship between capability and observability, to the point where as these systems become more powerful, our ability to understand what's going on under the hood is something that we're getting further and further away from. And I think that speaks to your whole idea of who's watching the Watchmen. We have this challenge of we really are. I mean, we are rapidly seeing companies adopting and integrating generative AI into so many different processes. And there is this question of, I mean, obviously these, like you said, I mean, I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest when you look at the way that the transformer architecture works, that these most likely, and I say most likely because I think there's still so much about consciousness that we don't understand, but most likely they are not conscious, and they certainly don't think, in quotes, the way that we do. It is all informed by kind of a sliding probability distribution where random sampling is accomplished as it draws every single token, and then that token is passed back through this autoregressive algorithm. And there's so much, it's almost a combination of just probability and randomness that's built into this that is, at the end, extremely impressive at what it's capable of doing. But it's not thinking the way that we do. And we have to remain mindful of that. One of the things that I thought was fascinating was I just saw an article the other day that spoke to just that fact of how these systems don't operate in the way that we think they do. And there was a couple things that it pointed out. And one of them that was fascinating was if you ask a large language model, and this is any of the large language models, to pick a random number between 1 and 100, it will invariably, and I tested this out after I read the article, it will almost always kind of fall back to a average of either 42 or 57. And of course, what's fascinating about this, and the comical thing is, well, maybe 42, for anybody that has followed the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, maybe 42 is the answer to the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. But I think more likely, and obviously what the article explains, is that overrepresented values that exist within all of that data that the system is trained on is always what it's going to lean towards. It's not going to lean towards truth. It's not going to lean towards any concept of rationale, despite how much it may seem like that because of how impressive these systems are. But it really is just probabilistically informed. And the fact that numbers like 42 and obviously we can make the connection on 42. I'm not sure the 57 one, but apparently there is something out there on the internet that if you ask these systems, give me a number between 0 and 100. I think I did it 5 different times after I read the article, and 2 of the times it gave me 42 and 2 of the times it gave me 57. So it's definitely a thing. I think it's not that surprising when you think about how these models work, but I think it does speak to that point that they don't think like we do, and we are putting so much faith in how these operate. And I think it does speak to the potential challenges that lie ahead. I think it also speaks to the importance of having someone watching the Watchmen, having that risk management that exists over any kind of AI operations that you're building into your organization.
And for the record, I just tested. I got 42.
Did you? Yep. I thought it was even more spot on than I thought it was going to be. Like now with some of the models, of course, with GPT-4, a lot of times if you ask it for a random number, it's going to try to resolve it with Python. So what I had to do with some of the models was kind of in parentheses, pick a number between 1 and 100 and don't use Python. And then, of course, when it did that, it would not use Python. It would rely on, of course, its own probabilistic knowledge, so to speak. But yeah, fascinating thought experiment. Definitely one that's worth trying out. I think that most of our listeners, if you give it a shot, or pick whatever model you want, all of them are more or less trained on a lot of the same data that's aggregated from the internet, and I think you're going to find the same result.
That's funny. So
as we continue to talk about the advancement of AI, and we've also consistently had this conversation of the advancement in humanoid robotics too. For the last few episodes, we've talked about Figure One, which was the company that partnered with OpenAI in order to create a humanoid robot. We also talked about Boston Dynamics' new Alpha robot, which has all kinds of creepy capabilities in terms of contorting its joints. And but so I think as we continue to talk about all of this, there's this fascinating topic that I think is coming up more and more in conversation, and it's this idea of the uncanny valley. And for anybody that's not familiar with that, this was a concept that was originally introduced in the early days of robotics in the 1970s by a Japanese computer scientist, theoretician named Mashiro Mori, and he coined this term, the uncanny valley, basically saying that as we continue to build out robotics and artificial intelligence capabilities, we try to make them more human-like, because that will appeal to us. That'll make the systems more approachable. We'll be more okay with interacting with systems that seem somewhat human. However, we get to a point where we get so close to human likeness that we reach what he calls the uncanny valley. So we've got, as we get closer to human likeness, we get more of a positive emotional knee-jerk response as we interact with these systems. Then we get to a point where they're so close but not quite there to human likeness, that there's just this very unsettling feeling, this very negative, visceral response of what is this thing that I'm interacting with? And then, of course, the only way that we get out of the uncanny valley is we get to a point where the systems are essentially indistinguishable from humanity itself. And I think it's a fascinating topic. I think that it does speak to what we've seen as a trend in technology for multiple years now. We've seen them try to anthropomorphize technology to make it seem more human-like. We've got stuff like Alexa and Siri, where we've got a human personification, even a gender identity in these conversational systems. And I don't think that those had quite gotten to that point of the uncanny valley yet. But of course, they are human enough that they're more appealing to us. And even with the ways that we interact with our computers, if you have, say, an application crash on your system, you might get an error that says, I'm sorry, your application has crashed. Well, the computer's not actually sorry. It doesn't feel any remorse for the fact that you lost your data. But that anthropomorphizing of the system, making it seem more human-like, is appealing. But then we have some prototypes that have come out of Japan where we go beyond just humanoid robotics to like putting skin on these things. Or Len, we were talking about before the episode, kind of the creepy sex dolls that are emerging, and some of those that are kind of so close to human, but enough distinguishable that it just has this very weird, creepy vibe to it. And then I think as we move into certain different modalities, we have already gotten to the point where we're crossing the uncanny valley, where we are seeing certain capabilities that are now getting to the point where they're indistinguishable. We just talked about GPT-4o, where I think that was the threshold where we've passed in audio conversation, the uncanny valley, where I think it's we talked about, what was it? Creepy T. So we talked about the fact that it is creepy, but I think it's contextually creepy, right? Because we know that it is an AI system. But if you were to talk to that thing and not realize that there was an AI on the other end, I think we are at that point where it is.
We're not dealing with like the original voice synthesizer from Windows 3.1.1, you know, where it sounded very robotic and metallic. You know, add a little deep fake in there. I mean, you know, we were talking earlier about, you know, voice actors. You can make anything sound like anything anymore. So I would agree with you that, you know, in terms of the audio, I think the only thing we're missing out of the 4.0 would be just a little bit quicker on the response. And that's about the only thing that it's missing.
Oh, see, to me, when I watched it, I felt like the response was pretty spot on with kind of human taking that brief moment to pause and think. And I think depending on the person, that may vary. But yeah,
that was
close.
The only part about it that I found that was like, okay, you can talk about anything. And the fact that it can actually gain access to the cameras and things and be aware of the rest of the world and your surroundings. You know, we're getting to that point, like you said. And what do we do when we get there? You know, on the opposite side of that, you know, we're talking, on one hand, we're looking at, you know, the robots and the automations that are almost indistinguishable from humans. But on the opposite side of that, I've read about 2 or 3 articles where we're starting to see more and more robots being used as sentries and guards. But these are still looking like something straight out of Doctor Who. But let's look at the progression. You know, if we look at what we see as humanoid androids, you know, in terms of the discussions of what we're seeing, using the sex dolls as one example, they're very lifelike. They look and appear as a human. If we have the ability to have that same kind of audio conversation, that's there. But it took us a while to get here. You know, do you remember what some of the first, you know, automated robots looked like?
Oh yeah. Some of them were, and it's interesting because I feel like we've gone in waves. It really has. It wasn't a straight uncanny valley, or it's getting better, it's getting better. Now it's creepy, and now it's I think that we played with that line for a while. I think the skin thing is something that some robotic groups did and others even pulled back from, like, okay, this is weird. So I think it's really gone in waves more than kind of a single uncanny valley. But yeah, I think even in the early days, as we were moving closer and closer to something that was kind of a humanoid appearance, just playing with the aesthetics of it, I think there were waves of this is really creepy.
But do you think that it might be we needed to go through those creepy stages to get to where we could actually accept the uncanny valley?
Well, I don't know if we accepted the uncanny valley, or has it just gotten so powerful that we've gotten past it where we're
Well,
because I think there is that question of in context. If you're aware that you're interacting with an AI, I think there is still, even if it is indistinguishable from human, if you know that there is an AI behind it, I think there still is some knee-jerk reaction. And so maybe that's an area where we do need to accept that. But I think in other cases, if we're not aware of what's on the other end, that it may, and in the digital world, that's commonly the case. You may not know whether there's a human or a machine behind different digital interactions that you're doing. I think it becomes a question of, has it just become so capable that we don't know the difference? We just assume it's human.
and that's kind of where I was going with that, my point. We started going down this road with things that look nothing like us. And then we let them talk. And we had to kind of get used to a machine talking to us. And like you were saying with the hills and the valleys to get here, it's almost as if as a society, we have to see it and go, oh, no, we're all up in arms. This is an abomination. And then we get used to it.
Yeah. I do.
And the thing that scares me, from beyond the idea that, we're this stuff is just creepy in and of itself. But back to what I was saying in terms of the sentries, what happens as this technology continues to improve and we start seeing more service bots that, to your point, may be very familiar and friendly to interact with. But where does that put us in terms of day to day? Because regardless, I don't know about you. Do you act? All right, let me ask you a different question. Do you think that we could ever get to the point where there could be we'll call it a synthetic human robot? Because I don't know if it'll be, I mean, we know for a fact that we can put human skin over an exoskeleton that will cut, bleed. So yeah, we can put real skin over a metal skeleton. But do you think we could ever get to the point where you could actually be talking like you and I are with something that is not biologically human and can be completely fooled?
I think absolutely. I think within probably the next decade, the technological capabilities will exist to do that. Now, I think that there is another question of whether or not it makes sense to go down that path. I think that a lot of the appeal of humanoid robotics following the human structure, the human form, makes sense because of the fact that we have a world that we have engineered around the human form. We have made desks to make sense for humans. We've made chairs for that. We've made cars for a human to sit down and operate them. And so many different things about the way that we've engineered the world was tailored to the human form that I think there is a certain level of value in favoring that humanoid form. But I think it also does beg the question, as technology continues to progress, are there better form factors for different things? Like for a century robot, is the human form really the best thing for a defense and policing system? Which I'm not advocating for a defense.
Oh, I'm not either.
Autonomous
But I
system.
think that also depends on what you're trying to defend. Case in point, if you're in a let's say you're a leader in industry and you need bodyguards. Do you want something that is going to look like a Terminator without its skin on, which is going to draw attention, or do you want something that can just blend in like a Secret Service person?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. There is an argument possibly to be made for the fact that if we can get to the point where it's indistinguishable, maybe blending in is the best way to not trigger that visceral response. I mean, we talked about the Waymo barbecues. So the fact that the Waymo autonomous driving vehicles recently have triggered kind of a visceral response from people where they're setting them on fire and vandalizing
I
them.
think you could
And I
just
think
say that it triggered people.
it triggered people. And I think that that is in acknowledgement of the fact of human displacement and the fact of autonomous robotics. And I think to the extent that we can make autonomous robotics blend in with humanity to where people can't distinguish between the two, then maybe that visceral reaction goes away. And I think that is somewhat of a kind of uncanny valley itself, of just
I,
that natural
I was going to
negative
say, I think
reaction
that's
that you have.
kind of the modern evolution.
For sure.
You know, you brought up the autonomous driving cars. I've actually saw an article where we both live in Texas, and I don't know if you saw, but one of the main thoroughfares they've now said are going to be allowed autonomous trucks.
Yep.
So I actually was reading an article where some of these companies that are investing in the autonomous trucks are considering putting mannequins in the driver's seats just to try and to the point of
Make
what
people
we're
more
saying,
comfortable when they see them.
they don't want people freaking out when they see a truck with, and they look up and then there's nobody in the driver's seat. So is the point of the Uncanny Valley by today's standards to actually, in order to allow the progression to get to the point, we actually have to maybe do some smoke and mirrors until we can actually get there?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely seems that way. I hadn't heard about the mannequins, but I mean, it does make sense when you think about it. When you think about kind of what we're seeing societally as some of that knee jerk reaction, and I'm not even going to necessarily say unfounded knee jerk reaction. I mean, I think for a lot of people, they're upset about the potential displacement of human labor and possibly even kind of what we have derived value from, which I mean, for a lot of people, I think having a meaningful career, being creative, a lot of the things that we're seeing these systems now be able to do these themselves is where we've pulled kind of from that human experience, that where we've gotten happiness and enjoyment out of life. And so I think that there is some reasonableness, some sanity to that knee jerk reaction. But I think you're right. There probably is an incentive in the technology companies that want to move forward to not just anthropomorphize that technology, but to, like you said, create smoke and mirrors, create this illusion of humanness
Normalization.
that we've already, until we can get to the point where it is indistinguishable and we've crossed that uncanny valley, just to suppress that negative response to the technology that's getting way too close already for comfort to what we as humans are capable of.
And one of the things that I was looking at when we talk about this is, let's. Have you ever? I want to say it's called People AI. Have you heard of this company?
It doesn't sound familiar. I don't think I have seen that.
This is the company that's taking all of the historical writings of people like Socrates, Leonardo da Vinci, Einstein, and they're building
Creating replicas of them.
they're building AI replica models of them.
So what's interesting, I have seen something similar to that, but it was more towards like this weird grief management thing of if you had
that was
a
the next
family
one I
member
was
that
actually going to
passed,
bring up.
can you gather together all of the text messages, the emails, the social media that you have from them, and to the extent that they can from that data set, build something that closely resembles something that you can chat with that makes you feel like you're chatting with them, which personally I don't know if that's the best way to manage grief in the
Actually, that I was
situation of a
about to say.
loss.
I was reading an article earlier today on that where there's now discussions about the need for legislation due to the continued trauma that these types of models can create for victims and loved ones.
Oh,
But
absolutely. You think about, we know that part of the psychological process of grief is you have to get to that point of acceptance. And I think if you are creating the illusion of still interacting with somebody that's passed, you don't get to that point of acceptance. You still are in this I think it almost reinforces that state of denial.
And if we take a look at the graphic on the screen, we talk about the valley, and you can see it on the graph, but what happens when we get to the other side of that? What does normal look like at that point? Like you said, we've got grief situations. You have the ability to have discussions with historical figures. And what happens when I'm trying to think of the right way to say this without sounding like a complete fool, because I can almost foresee a point where does that line of reality finally completely disappear? I mean, because if we've talked in the past about the concept of digital immortality. If we can get to that point and anybody can make a robot or an AI model based on somebody's life and their written experiences and all the data points that are available, does the reaching the other side of the uncanny valley almost equal digital immortality in some ways?
Well, I think so. I think we get to the at least if you look at the world through, say, Ray Kurzweil's eyes, we get
Mm-hmm.
to a point where digital capabilities become so impressive that we integrate those into our own biology. It almost becomes a matter of necessity. And I think that we do get to a point where they're so intrinsically bound together that there isn't, maybe we lose that.
I guess that's the
It's no
question.
longer even machine and human. Is
Is
just
that the point where
existence.
we lose our humanity?
Very potentially, yeah. I think there's a fascinating dichotomy of, or almost a full spectrum of perspectives about what that singularity looks like. Everything from just extreme utopia of the world becomes this unbelievably beautiful place where everything is solved, we live forever in perfect harmony with these machines, all the way to that absolute dystopia of we lose our humanity in the process and potentially destroy the world in the process. And it's really hard to say where on that spectrum it actually lands, because the future is so strange and things are moving so quickly. And it does seem like that is the trajectory that we're going towards. But trying to understand exactly what that looks like and what that means for the subjective human experience is really
Well,
hard
that
to
was going to be
imagine.
my next question, and I know this is one of those 1,000-foot questions, but it is the concept of biology the only thing that makes somebody human at that point?
Yeah,
Is it
and
a
I think
heart?
that's a question of semantics, right? Like, it
Yeah,
just
I
depends on
mean,
how you define humanity.
and I think the scary part is when we reach the other side of that dip, that's going to be a question that's going to, I think, us as humans and humanity as a whole is going to have to actually have those hard questions answered.
I think that's going to be a very chaotic period in time as we try to settle on what that looks like, because I think that there is going to be a lot of very strong feelings in both ways. I think Mo Gadot, the guy that wrote Scary Smart, he kind of talks about the future in this way, and he believes that we will get to that point of utopia with AI, but he does talk about the fact that we are going to inevitably go through an extremely difficult, challenging time of reconciling kind of that digital intelligence with our own before we get there. And I think that that is probably part of that very difficult time, that process of trying to define for ourselves, for the entire world, what is humanity? What is, I mean, and I think it gets into all of those questions that, as strange as it sounds, you look at something like Isaac Asimov's Bicentennial Man, where they had to come to grips with this idea of, does artificial intelligence get to a point where it's entitled rights? And it is, you have to respect those rights in the same way that you would humans. And I think we are going to get to that point, and
I
probably
agree
not
with
too
that as
far
well.
out. I think in the next couple decades, there's probably going to be people that start pushing that agenda of rights of digital intelligence. And
Hmm.
I think that that itself is going to be an extremely divisive issue.
Well, if we're both still alive at that point, we're going to be well into our senior years. Let's make a date right here, right now, to pull up somewhere on the west lawn with a couple of lawn chairs and some popcorn.
Cybercognition 2044.
Yep, we may not have teeth, we may be windwalkers, but we're still going to have opinions. I promise you that.
Yep, for sure. All right. Well, with that, I think we'll plan on that in 20 years and
sounds like a plan to me, my man.
I think that it is going to be an interesting couple of decades. I think that it will be fascinating to look back on, hopefully, and see how close to the mark we were. I think there's still a lot of questions as far as the direction that things are going. And I do think that it's just kind of bringing it back to that topic of the uncanny valley. I think that we talked about how really just in this past couple of weeks, we saw, I think, the escape of the uncanny valley on the audio side. I think we already have seen that in the images side too. I think
Absolutely.
we were in the uncanny valley about a year ago when all of the images had the weird fingers and stuff. But now if you look at the frontier models, like they're pretty much indistinguishable from reality. I think we still are probably in the uncanny valley as far as video replication goes and as far as spatial robotics goes. I think we still look at things like Figure One and like Atlas and say, whoa, that's really creepy. But I think the others we only think are creepy because we have
like they should be in a horror movie.
Oh, they do. The
way they move, it's just
But so it is fascinating time to be alive as we move through this uncanny valley. And I don't even know if this will be a discussion in 10 years. We may be so far beyond the uncanny valley that this just becomes a topic of history.
That the uncanny valley, I think, is eventually going to just be a vague memory in the rear view.
For sure. All right. Well, awesome conversation. Any final notes, Len?
Thank you all for listening. And as always, leave us a comment, send us an email. We'd love to hear from you.
All right. Cybercognition over and out.
Peace.